Now, in this conversation, even before we begin, I'd like to thank the Ministry of ICT here in Rwanda for actually setting this up and making this happen. As His Excellency Paul Kagame stated last year during the United Nations General Assembly, he said that these sustainable development goals are also Africa's goals, and that's why we're here today. During this panel discussion, we'll just be discussing how the continent can unleash the power of technology and innovation in achieving economic, social, as well as environmental development as we actually achieve the sustainable development goals. Now, with me, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Next to me, we have Eva Iradukunda, who is the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of ICT and Innovation here in Rwanda. Before this, he served as the Rwanda Country Director at Alan and Gil Gray Philanthropy. He also founded different organizations that promote entrepreneurship among youth. Thank you so much for joining us. Yes, and right next to him, we have Natalie Mnyapenda, who is the CEO of Kepler. Prior to that, Natalie was the Managing Director at the Next Einstein Forum, building Africa's community of scientists, curating the premier Science and Innovation Conference, and pushing for science-driven industrialization through foresight and policy work. Thank you so much, Natalie. Yes, and at the far end, we have Patrick Buchana, who is the founder and CEO of AC Group. AC Group is a company here in Rwanda that is providing a smart mobility solution across Rwanda, Cameroon, and Kenya. He is a recipient of a number of ICT awards and was named among Forbes under 30 that are shaping the future of the continent. Thank you for making time to be with us. And finally, joining us online, we have Eniola Mafe, lead 2030 Vision Technology and Sustainable Development at the World Economic Forum. She is a strategist and international development leader with a track record in facilitating high-level policy dialogue and partnership building and accelerate Africa's transformation agenda. Eniola, it's great having you with us. Now, as we begin this conversation, looking at the different achievements that the panelists have had in different sectors, I'd just like to know for each and every one of us to tell us, what are some of the solutions that you have created? What are some of the solutions that you have actually brought out here on the continent in relation to unleashing tech and innovation solutions?
Thank you. Something that comes to mind and that we are most proud of at the Ministry of ICT Innovation here in Rwanda is a recent program that we put together, the Rwanda Coding Academy. This is actually responding to the challenge of talent. One of the biggest issue is our ability to innovate our own solution. And I think the Rwanda Coding Academy is training software engineering, embedded systems, and cybersecurity. And these are young talent that are going to be helping us to innovate and participate in creating solutions that address our challenges.
So thank you for this opportunity. At Kepler, we offer bachelor's degrees in partnership with Southern New Hampshire University. And we were much more ready than most organizations with the pandemic. Our courses were already blended, and the pandemic happened when we had finished the in-person side, so we were able to quickly switch to online learning. And I think that is critical going forward. I think we've been talking about it for years, about blended learning, online learning, and that revolution coming to Africa. But I think we had not prepared both on the infrastructure level, both on access and affordability of internet, and all these other prerequisites that allow for an edtech or an e-learning environment to be able to thrive. The pandemic has really pushed us into the direction where it's now really required. And at Kepler, we were able to make that transition. Part of that is because we spend 6 months with our students, giving them technology skills so that they're able, and other skills like creativity, 21st century skills. So they're able to transition quite quickly and teach themselves how to learn, which is what we need to do going forward, is to have people have the ability to learn, to teach themselves through the different opportunities online.
Sure, thanks for that. So we're into this smart transport space, and we an equivalent of the Metro card or Oyster card, and our philosophy is creating efficiency around public transport, connecting people to business, connecting people to other people, and looking at Africa as a continent. the rate of rural-urban migration is significant, and by 2030, Africa will have the most populous cities in the world. But what does that mean? It means mobility is going to become a challenge. When you go to cities like Nairobi, traffic congestion is insane. Lagos and a few others, it's even worse. The way to curb that is through having efficient transport means that reduce the individual cars on the road, that reduce the pollution that comes from people, driving an SUV with just one person or two people in it. And so we use innovation to create efficiency within public transport, and have a mode of commuting that can be used by all segments of the population and still feel comfortable and efficient while making their commute.
Oh, okay, thank you guys. Now, Eniola, to just come to you, what are some of the innovations and achievements that you've actually had in different sectors across the continent when we look at innovation and technology?
Thank you, Fiona. I think in connection with the comments that have been made earlier, our role at the World Economic Forum as it pertains to the 2030 vision is primarily around combining these two functions. So this is a partnership that was launched earlier this year in partnership with UNDP and Unlimited, and it was combining these two pieces. One is knowing that the current leverage and speed of technologies in the service of the global goals delivery is somewhat slow, especially in some of the key metrics or SDGs that really matter specifically for African nations and global south. And then it's also knowing that there needed to be a quantum leap in that progress. So the idea is that into those challenges and bring together and foster collaboration between all of the solutions drivers, solutions owners, and connect the dots in a better way. So most recently, a piece of that puzzle that we're really proud of is a recent framework just published a couple of days ago, actually, that creates some of the forms of a piece of the puzzle for practical tools for private sector to engage. So that doesn't mean CSR, that doesn't mean just being able to have strategic philanthropy. How can we augmenting their existing technologies that could be used within their supply chains? This is large companies as well as the more innovative, newer entrants into the technology ecosystem, and we want results. So in order to do that, we have to focus on this integrated approach. So some of the outputs around that include an incubator on the global goals. Number two, around country facilitation, which will be launched for the next month. And we're in talks with many countries in the global south around these. So that's about, we're at an interesting juncture where we are going into full delivery mode, and we're welcoming more partners to engage there. We have about 20 partners represented, many of the 500 tech companies, as well as who are knowledge partners, to find those connected issues that can drive and accept the kind of integrated approach we need for technology in the service of global goals.
Okay. Now, in the conversation, we'll be getting more into what kind of partnerships actually need to be created between the public sector and the private sector in creating the right infrastructure here on the continent. Now, Natalie, to just come back to you, you are in the education sector, and this is one of the sectors that has been hit greatly by the COVID-19 pandemic. You touched briefly on what Kepler is doing in order to adapt to these times, but just to talk to us about the impact that this pandemic has had on this particular sector and the solutions that are on ground at this moment.
Yeah, I think most sectors have been affected very significantly on the continent, whether it's commerce and the different industries. But education, we're in Rwanda today and our kids are at home, so our schools are currently closed, and around the continent close to 300 million kids are out of school. And of those 300 million kids, we have about close to 20 million who have access to e-learning, and less than 3 million who have access to EdTech. EdTech is the use of technology in learning and teaching. And so that presents a very big challenge. What we're noticing is that those who have access to e-learning today through the pandemic already had access before. And we're seeing an uptick of companies like Inez Education that offer in Kenya and Ivory Coast, I believe, and other countries. They provide tutoring and learning through USSD, SMS. And they have seen an uptick, a jump close to 300,000 users, daily users. And so we are seeing the use of EdTech jump because we need those type of solutions because a majority of kids countries on the continent are either opening up right now or are still closed in terms of education. So there is an opportunity at the moment for governments and companies in partnerships to be able to invest in the edtechs that have already proven that they're working. They have a proof of concept and they need funding to be able to scale. So the edtech space is very much underinvested in on the continent. And at the moment, we're seeing that has a very, very big effect. But I just want to bring up that it is not just enough to invest in the technology itself, the education technology, the companies scaling, helping these companies scale. It's also very critical that we think about all the other challenges. So, basic infrastructure. We need a better school. Now that we have to have more space in our classrooms, we're noticing that it's very challenging that we need more classrooms. So there's infrastructure issues that are critical, basic infrastructure. There is digital infrastructure that needs to be there to be able to provide access to internet for students. And access means, it means more than just providing, for example, we saw it in Rwanda with 1 laptop per child. It's not enough to provide the laptop per child. We need access to affordable internet. We need teachers and learners to have access to digital skills so that they can be able to leverage the technology and use it to be able to learn. And so I think in the education sector, we have come under quite a lot of pressure to change even our business models, because we have to be able to afford to continue to pay our staff while they're not working, and to switch towards e-learning, which is an investment. The big universities and education institutions that have done that have invested $1 million per degree to be able to make it interactive and learning, $1 million US. And none of us have that type of money, and so we have to be able to leverage on open tech, open access tech, and build on that. And so we need the support of the government as well as private investors to be able to scale some of these things.
Yes, and we're creating solutions as the challenges come. If I may say, Eve, coming to you, Natalie has just touched on some numbers. She said that on the continent, there are close to 300 million learners who are out of school currently because of the pandemic. 19 million of those have access to e-learning platforms, while about 2 million have access to EdTech. These are the solutions that we have today, but aren't they creating more inequalities as opposed to being as inclusive as they should be?
Thank you, and that's the most critical part of this situation that we found ourselves in, where overnight we had to switch from learning that bases on in-classroom, in-person learning, to going online. Like Natalie alluded to, most institutions in most countries, most academic facilities were not ready or equipped to make that switch. But what it means for us is that we need to rethink about the education for the future. Luckily, at Kepler, as you mentioned, you had already started using this blended learning, leveraging the technology. But how do we then make sure that affordable devices and the right infrastructure is put in place? And I think the issue around affordability is critical. That one we must continue to address through partnerships, because I don't think it's going to be only for government, because the same infrastructure can be leveraged for education, but also for service delivery in all sectors. We're talking about agriculture. During the pandemic, we saw e-commerce platform, for instance, emerging and connecting to the farmers. But that also goes to financial inclusion. And other different services, whether by government or by the private sector. So it is critical that governments, but also all partners to come together to create this infrastructure. But in the short term, the issue of inequalities are real, and I think this calls for action for us to come together and address these issues. In Rwanda in particular, what we are seeing also is the level of digital skills, not only for the students that are needing to now switch to e-learning platforms, but even for the facilitators. And I'm sure you may have gone through upskilling the teachers to make sure that they're even able to leverage the existing tools to deliver the content. So in Rwanda, as a government, is really even going back and realizing, even when we have these tools and the infrastructure, we must reinvest in upskilling, starting with the teachers, on the government side, or the government public servants, but ultimately equipping the general citizenry to have the right tools, the right skills to adopt these digital platforms that we are having to use now.
Now, if to just come back to you, you've just said partnerships are key and that the government shouldn't be the one responsible, but rather the private sector should also step in. But presently, who is doing the heavy lifting and what can be done to create a strong coalition between the two parties?
Thank you, Fiona. Let me just quickly reflect on the journey we've had in Rwanda. Our digitization journey started about 20 years ago, initially by creating an enabling environment. For those who remember, around that time, we only had one telecom. But by creating enabling environment, we have seen many internet service providers, we have seen more telecommunication companies coming in, and that allowed to build the right infrastructure. And the most critical project actually was laying the fiber connectivity across the country. And that enabled more services to be connected online. So government has invested heavily in that backbone infrastructure to allow connectivity, but then creating that environment that invites private sector, but also continuing further to bring in initiatives. The most recent, until announced in partnership with the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and the UNICEF, is the Giga Initiative, where the goal is to connect all schools. And we are starting the pilot of 1,000 schools this year. So we're seeing the effort that needs to continue to be done, whether, again, private sector and government, but also inviting all partners. And the good news is that we are seeing even these companies being even more innovative in their product offering. In particular, during COVID-19, we saw fiber to home connection increasing, thanks to different companies that are coming up with the right model and also the right pricing to make sure that even homes can be connected to this backbone infrastructure that has been built over the last 20 years.
Now, Patrick, to just come to you, you are in the private sector, and in the past you've been quoted saying that there are some cities here on the continent that are not ready to adapt some of the products of AC Group, like Tap and Go, for example. You know, looking at the barriers that we have here on the continent, would you say that it is something that an investor will be willing to come? And with everything that we have to address today, what are some of those barriers?
I think the barriers around regulation. So public transport is a regulated space in a number of countries. In cases where the regulations are there, but there is no compliance, or there is no kind of relationship between the public transport operators and the government, there's a very gray area, which makes it very difficult for us to then come in and make investments. So the options there are then that we need to raise money locally from that particular market, which becomes very difficult when you look at some of the sizes of countries or the population or the way and numbers of people commuting. But I think things are improving. There's a lot of collaboration that needs to be done. Regulators are always talking, transport regulators, and I think there has been best practices that some countries have adopted that have allowed innovations like tap and go to be able to start. A very vivid example is Nairobi, where we're launching this year. NTSA looked a lot at what Rwanda has done, the regulator in Rwanda, RURA, and almost tried to replicate to be able to adopt innovations like tap and go and many others that had previously failed. I think this is something that could be a lesson for many other countries in various sectors. But yeah, regulation usually is the biggest. Of course, there's many other challenges like mindset, but that comes with building a business. The change in mindset, the change in behavior, that's part of growing a product in the market.
Yes. Now, Natalie, to come to you, the fourth industrial revolutions have been cited by experts as a chance for the continent to leapfrog and catch up with the rest of the world. But looking at some of the challenges that are still facing the continent, what Patrick has just touched on briefly, what do you think is still holding back? Do you think actually this is a reality, considering that we are still having certain challenges, we haven't achieved some of the goals that we've set, yet we are talking a fourth industrial revolution, we are talking catching up with the rest of the world?
Yes, I think that there is a lot of opportunity on the continent because we've been behind. I think there is a great opportunity for technology adoption. There is a desire to leverage technology to improve agriculture, the different sectors that are key to the well-being of citizens on the continent. I think what the challenge is, and we see that even with the coming into effect very soon of the Africa Free Trade area, is that we have a challenge of implementation. And so we have to come at it from a systematic level. The investments that we currently need to make in infrastructure, for example, even if we build the greatest e-commerce companies on the continent, if we do not have roads where these goods are going to go to, that is a challenge. We have an issue of digital identity all across the continent where people are not identified digitally, and so you cannot have commerce or any other access to health and access to all these things that we're trying to do through technology. We also have, as he said, a regulation issue where regulators are not as open as they should be to be able to see how it goes before they make decisions on regulation. And we are also not learning lessons from the MENA region or Asia region on how they've been able to do it, and even on different population scales. And then there is a big issue of investments, available funding, and that comes from the fact that even our local investors are not willing to take risks. We are building large banks, and that's great, and maybe that's not the future. We're not spending enough time building the technology companies. And I always say that the idea of Silicon Valley, when I worked at the Next Science and Forum, the Silicon Valley came from, and I want to end with this, the skills portion is very important. There was per capita, a large number of engineers who had access to financing from their own families, so they could fail and fail forward. But they also had access to, whether it's philanthropically at the beginning, but investors who were willing to really invest in 100 projects and come out with only 2 unicorns, right? These are billion-dollar companies. And so we do not have that kind of mindset where you have to have an expectation that some of these companies will fail and then they will be maybe recycled into a product in a completely different industry. And the big thing we are missing is skills. And I think we need to get out of saying, we have the next revolution is coming, but actually systematically address basic digital infrastructure and identity and all the issues related to that. How are we going to fund this? What are the industries that we want to compete in, and how will we address the skills gap? And we have to get out of the traditional education. I'm from a university, so it's a traditional education institution, but there are many, many ways. Google no longer, I think it's Google and Facebook, if I'm not mistaken, that are not requiring degrees when you become an engineer. coming out of the best coding academies. And so when you remove the requirement for degrees, we have to find other ways to be able to build up the talent we need for the industries that we're building the future. And I know that Iniola would have more to say on this because this is her area.
Yeah, I was actually coming to Eniola. I was saying, Natalia just touched on what needs to be addressed first before we even start considering the adoption of the fourth industrial revolutions. But just coming to, you can just share with us some of the experience working in this sector, as well as what actually really needs to be done for this to adopt here on the continent.
Absolutely. So to be honest, I'm on one side, I'm very amazed and kind of inspired by that innovation coming out of the technology sector, aligned sectors across the continent. But what we find on the continent that is mainly driven by the innovation of necessity, being entrepreneurs and innovators being painkillers. And I think this is a real lesson and also a huge potential that I think, to the points that have been made earlier, if we wrap around that basic digital infrastructure that can really support fundamentals, connectivity, digital identity, all of those pieces that are not really commercially viable to private sector point, but need to happen. They need to be the digital highways, in a sense. Taking an example from the US highway system, it wasn't necessarily it was an investment in long-term infrastructure needed from which entrepreneurs, innovators, frontier technologies can build upon and be able to expand rapidly, especially for the continent. So whether it's blockchain solutions that can provide greater transparency, security, efficiency, with AI in terms of data analytics, it can provide data in ways, or at least support data that is somewhat latent across many of the private sector and public sector bases, and to utilize that to be able to be in the service of the SDGs and provide us with better understanding of what our citizens need, what do our entrepreneurs need, what are the needs from a social, economic development perspective. And so what I see that is missing is we do find this kind of lack of a unified, and I don't mean that continental vision or anything. It's what does 2030 actually look like? What does it feel like to be everything? Are they able to get a bank account in a quicker amount of time? Are they able to have a phone or a tool that can give them access to information in a smarter, more rapid way? Is there increased usability of these frontier technologies that has been able to proliferate not to the elite but to everyone else? And I think we've talked a little bit about this. Previous speakers kind of talked about this in terms of this ubiquitous of the technology. It's not so good that it's the 1% of the 1% of the population. It needs to really proliferate and really make a difference in the everyday lives. And I think it's so telling that we're seeing that the SDGs are not on track. In many of the we're seeing that Africa really needs. So we're seeing in terms of climate, in terms of hunger, we're falling back, and especially exacerbated by COVID, by economic downturns, by in some cases leadership or lack thereof. So I'm really thinking about integrated approach enablers of this. We're talking about skills development, finance, data, investment in R&D that I think was mentioned earlier, public policy, smart policy. There's some examples we're seeing it right here in Rwanda, where we're seeing that there is a long-term vision of I think a much longer-term vision of 2050, a mid-term vision of 2030, that really kind of looks at what do we need to be able to create the world that we want. I think those are foundational, and those are the kind of responsibility that needs to be shared across leadership, not only in public sector, not only in the civil society and IGO world, also in private sector and private business. So I'll share and kind of open up, share. I know that the others will share some more thoughts. that, but just wanted to kind of have those pieces around what is missing and how we could move forward. Even the non-tech side of the tech expansion.
Okay, if coming to you, Neil has just touched on the importance that ICT has to being playing a key role, the central role in achieving certain countries' vision. Yes, when you look at Rwanda's development agenda from the very beginning, ICT was a priority. Why do you think that the government actually had to put this as a priority, looking at what has been achieved today?
Thank you. I think that's a quite a powerful question, and I think Natalie and Yola touched on some of these aspects. So when this decision or the vision of the country to put ICT at the center, it was quite intentional from the leadership of the country to see how do we move from an economy that is based on agriculture and very limited manufacturing at the time to actually transition to a knowledge-based economy. And when you look at the progress has been made today as far as economic development, it's all built on having ICT as infrastructure that enables all other sectors. We've seen, because of ICT, we've seen the increase, for instance, of tourism activity because Rwanda positioned itself as a hub for meeting. And the conferences that have happened here are also leveraging on this ICT infrastructure. When you look at agriculture, programs such as Smart Ngunganire, when you look at healthcare, adopting technological systems, including bringing in drones into delivery of medical essential supplies. And then you look at financial sector that has boomed because of that ICT infrastructure. So it was quite intentional early on from the leadership of the country to create an environment that leverages this infrastructure to accelerate the economy. And something also quite powerful that I think Natalie and Patrick also spoke about is innovation. The infrastructure alone and the right policies are not enough. We have to invest in talent development, developing the right skills to leverage this infrastructure. So we've seen institutions such as Carnegie Mellon University coming in Rwanda as a result of that vision. We've seen Africa Mathematical Institute of Science. We've seen ALU coming in. We've seen Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture, University of Global Health Equity, and of course Kepler and other institutions that are heavily investing in talent. And I talked about Rwanda Coding Academy, for instance, that we have at the ministry. So there are so many interesting initiatives that came in to leverage this vision of ICT as a pillar. Now it's critical time to really develop the talent and innovate. But innovation requires collaboration, which is, I think, important to note. We must continue to bring all these various partners, whether from academic training institutions, investors that are coming in to leverage the various policies to ensure that Rwanda continues to innovate solutions that can scale in Africa and across the continent.
Now, Patrick, to come to you, he's just touched on the importance of empowering the young generation, creating conducive places where they can actually go and get the skill set from, looking at the market today, looking at the young people making up actually a bigger portion here on the continent, a population. Would you say that they are equipped with the skills of the future?
Well, I don't know if I'm in the right position to talk about the skills on behalf of the young people, but I can tell you for sure we are lagging behind in very many areas that will enable us to become innovation hubs, different regions on the continent. And I think the single most important element for innovation is an enabling environment, which I think Eve talked about. And this is from the regulation that myself and Natalie talked about. This comes from the institutions that are supposed to empower and promote innovation. Because when that environment is created, entrepreneurs are naturally very resilient people. I'll give you an example. We have a challenge of raising funds here in Rwanda. But a company like ours got money all the way from Japan, from an institution that does not even invest in Africa. And this shows you that when an enabling environment is created, which it was, one from the Ministry of ICT, from RURA, from the Ministry of Infrastructure, it gave us the space to be able to confidently know that our product is going to grow in a market that is supporting it. And then the rest of it is about figuring it out. You will get engineers from Rwanda, you will get engineers from India. And the moment people from the market can see AC Group paying 30 engineers lump sum amounts that are previously paid to managers in the bank, what will Kepler do? It will start focusing on training engineers. Same thing with Carnegie Mellon, which is already doing, but the number will definitely increase. You will have more children interested in becoming engineers because they can see that it is actually where one, the pay is, where two, the growth is, three, we just had an announcement of, I think, the city of MTN joining Facebook. It's stories like this that create the markets and create elements that enable schools to be able to convert, building of more coding schools. You can hear that the Ministry of ICT has invested in a coding school, but it will make sense at some point in the future for a private company to invest in a coding school because they know there is a market for that, and there's uptake from that from various tech companies. And so the right environment, I think, is the single most important element that should be focused on, and a lot more dynamics are created. And finally, I also think we should, as a continent, be very deliberate on promoting market-creating innovations. And these are innovations that have much more impact than the founder making millions of dollars. These are innovations that change sectors. These are innovations that create jobs both locally and internationally. Very good examples are M-Pesa, which has has grown in Kenya, and I think is now looking at growing in various other countries. And we also need to be very deliberate about promoting locally grown companies, owned and promoted locally, not just in our markets, but even in nearby countries. China, when Alibaba and WeChat, owned by Tencent, were starting out, China deliberately kept other payment platforms out of the country to enable them to grow. Today, Alibaba and WeChat can compete on the global market because that was done. And number two, the Central Bank of China did not have the framework to regulate Alibaba and WeChat. And what they did is that they gave them a non-objection to allow them to kick off as they figure out how they're going to regulate. This has also happened with RURA. I keep giving RURA as an example because they are the institution that we work with. But I think more of this needs to be done. More of this promotion needs to be done, and we need to be very deliberate about it. Otherwise, even when we create these frameworks and environments that are good, they might be more conducive for companies that come from Europe, where they've already grown, and you find that the balance of trade that we are always fighting with doesn't change, even though we're having local innovations.
Natalie, to come to you, I've just seen you've been nodding your head as Patrick gave the response there. He's saying being deliberate, and one of the things that need to be focused on is actually creating the right policies here on the ground, as well as working on creating PPPs that enable the certain developments, whether it's in infrastructure, in different sectors. Just talk to us about this and what African governments can actually do to drive up PPPs adoption here on the continent.
Sure. I just want to piggyback on something he said. So he mentioned that China protected its payments sector to be able to allow it to grow. And today Alibaba and other companies, we can't even talk about the kind of size they have at the moment. And part of that is because they were investing in these companies, right? And so part of the challenge we have on the continent is a lot of the investments, especially in critical sectors, are coming from outside. and therefore you become obliged to open up the sector to others because you are also taking some of this funding. So it's critical that these investment sector investments on the continent, local investments, really be strengthened, and the government can governments across the country continent can incentivize us. You know, if we cannot build infrastructure, can we incentivize the private sector to do so? If we can't train at the level that we need to, can we incentivize the private sector or partnerships for that? In South Africa and in other parts, in North Africa, especially in Egypt, they have created cluster systems where they say, for example, South Africa said we want to be competitive in the medical devices, the medical pharmaceutical industry. And so they addressed the issues of infrastructure and funding and skills at the same time. And they brought everyone together and they said, where are we going to get this money? How can we build these skills? What infrastructure will be required? And they brought private sector partners, development partners, the government, and they really talked about, you know, these meetings were more like problem solving. How can we fix this infrastructure issue? And that's the type of implementation, because the issue is that in Africa we spent a lot of time putting out papers, you know, committing ourselves to agreements that are never implemented. And today with COVID, we've seen we need to move away from speeches, and we really need to come together in smaller clusters and incentivize the private sector to be able to put some money down so that we can do this. And as Patrick was saying, social innovation is critical. If we are going to achieve the SDGs, we need to focus on scale. And scale comes from being able to identify what are the companies, you know, for the last 2 years I've been working on that. How do you identify companies in the different sectors that we've identified that can be scaled to at the level that they're making $1 billion? And not just $1 billion, but they're creating jobs and they're having a palpable effect on the different industries and the lives of Africans, right? And if we're able to identify these companies, can we invest in them? Can we make sure the policies are conducive? The issue we're having is that we have many companies, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing, in the same sector, when we really need to be able to quickly identify the social innovations or the innovations of the companies that have already done the proof of concept, whatever the case is, and to give them some money for piloting, which is 25 million, give them some money for demonstration, which is 150 million. This is the level of funding that is required. And we need to stop doing just hackathons, because the time for hackathons, there is a time for hackathons and there's a space for that. But if we really want to talk about large scale change and impact, we really need to be investing, understanding that each company requires 150 million.
Now, that is a very interesting. Now, we're running out of time for today's conversation, but before we go, I'd just like to take some questions from the audience. We have a question from Jake, who is in New York, and he says that studies show that women in tech industry constitute only 28% of professionals in the sector worldwide, and just 30% in the sub-Saharan Africa. You know, that represents a lot of untapped talents. Now, Eniola, I'd like to direct this question to you. Now, how can we get more women involved in the ICT sector? What needs to be done to create a conducive environment for them?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I think that the expertise concerning 4IR tech is really not abundant enough. We have, I think, to some points that were earlier mentioned, we have clustering around somewhat oversaturated areas. We have a lot in fintech, although there is still growth in that sector. I think that what we need to look at, especially if we engage and grow, because I will say that there are women involved in tech. What I think we need to talk about is, are they involved in the decision making, the large financial decisions that are made in technology? They have budgets, and if they are in large tech companies, to be able to talk to and engage with women-owned businesses and be able to understand some of the issues that they would deal with in the tech world. Are we thinking broadly about what we mean by tech is an enabler? And what we realize is there is no tech sector. There are companies, industries that utilize technology. So in health, in education, where Natalie is, and in other sectors that are increasing their tech functionality and their tech competence. We need to think really kind of horizontally in terms, in terms of the growth within technologies, so very basic skills, coding and technologists to understand the policy side. We need like an ecosystem approach there, so having that involvement, so that you're seeing people, women who are involved in almost every single and then we also need broader across industry. So I think it's kind of a bit of both that is, especially for African nations. In my country, Nigeria, there's enough hackathons and STEM programs getting girls into science. But what we need to have is a value chain, like an ecosystem of value. We make sure that we have consumers who are skilled enough for women. How do we have intermediaries? How do we have people like myself who are technologists looking at how to connect the dots? We need them at every single area. And two ways I think we can do that. Number one is to focus on tech. We're really looking at quality and breadth. Conversation about women in tech shouldn't be conversation, should be action. Companies should be looking externally and understand that to take the next 10 years, decade of delivery, to meet SDG goals, to be a citizen, whatever it means, requires you to involve the citizens who are going to be. And what we find is the new users, the 3.6 billion who will be on, who want to get online over the next couple of years, are predominantly women, are vulnerable populations, are those who are not connected in society in the physical sense, who need to be connected. And who better to understand those pieces of intersectionality and women? So I wouldn't want to say that you should have a woman in your organization because you need to have a woman, but it's because it's the right thing to do and it makes business sense. And if you want to be able to increase your value in the tech field, it's a no-brainer. And I think it's very important that African nations understand that and the government support those efforts at a wholesale level, not just in small pieces and bite-sized smattering of ideas.
Oh, thank you, Aniela. Now, Eva, just bring the same to you. What is Rwanda doing to ensure that no one is actually left behind as the continent digitizes? In just a few words.
Thank you very much. I think that's an effort that requires all of us to collaborate. One of the initiatives we have at the ministry is a Digital Inclusion Council that brings together government institutions, academia, development partners, banks, and all these other telecoms, all these other players that are needing the skills, particularly digital skills. So the role of the council is actually trying to make sure that our respective programs and interventions can at least create this universal digital literacy at the minimum, and then build on that to even accelerate and go further. A particular program at the ministry also is a digital ambassadors program to train the citizens, where we select graduates and give them a training with ICDL, International Computer Driving License, and we deploy them to different villages across the country with a mandate to train a number of citizens per month. They're equipped with a computer, connectivity, and the smartphones, and they basically go door to door or position themselves at different centers to train citizens. We've seen that very useful, and we are scaling the program to make sure that even more skills can be added for the citizens. We're also reflecting within government, how can digital skills enable us to provide better services to the citizens in general. With the move to work remotely in particular, we realized that actually productivity continued, but we know we can do even better. We know we can do even more if we can continue to upskill all the public servants. So there are various initiatives and programs led by the Rwanda Development Board, our Chief Skills Office, to ensure that public servants can enroll in these different digital training so that by the end of the year, this fiscal year, everyone has gone through training. Of course, starting intermediate for those who are at that level, then even advanced for those that have jobs that require the use of technology on a daily basis. So, but the journey must be one that we work together. We invite all partners, both in Rwanda and globally, that may have tools and systems that enable to develop digital skills at a large scale, so that our population can truly leverage from these solutions that we are seeing on the market.
We've come to the end of this session, but before we go, I'd like each panelist to just share their final remarks, as well as tell me if there's a certain market or sector here on the continent that you feel like hasn't really unleashed the potential of tech and science. What is it, and what do you think can be done? I'll start with Patrick.
I think I'll start with agriculture. There's so much potential we have to win in agriculture, and we're lagging behind. And innovation should not just be seen in the perspective of technology and having smartphones and the likes. Innovation can still be done without necessarily using these tools. And I think, young people should have this as their challenge and take it up.
I just want to say three quick things. I think the first thing is, as we build technologies, we really have to be thinking about the accountability and responsibility as we build technology. Because even in agriculture, we know that we have to protect our soils, we have to protect our climate. And so we have to just not be investing in things that make productivity higher, but that damage our ecosystem. And so that requires a whole of society approach to how we build technology. Number two, coming back to the question of equity, the digital skills is the foundation, and it's very critical, because even if you make products, somebody has to buy them online. So we need digital skills and access to services digitally. But I think to get more women, and as we see in global companies, we're challenged at the moment, even with AI and other technology, that we need to have women and different and diversity in the building of technology. But women need to see that they can have careers and not jump out because of the toxicity in the technology world. So we have to have a way to show young women very early what are the opportunities, and coming from a skills perspective, we have to be able to channel skills. If at Kepler, I am told that in the next 5 years, we are going to be hiring blockchain engineers. We need more of this type of technology, this type of vocational technical skills in this industry. I will be happy to make that, to create that degree or that training or certificate that would allow someone to become a professional. So there needs to be more conversations and more deliberate investments in getting the skills that we need. And I just want to say that innovation is important, but we need to build technical skills, and Africa will be the hub of skills for the world, whether the world likes it or not. And it's up to us to be able to prepare ourselves. And every 15 years there will be new industries, and some will be dying. And so we have to really be able to adapt. Adaptability, I think, is a critical skill going forward.
Thank you, Natalie. And building on your point around technical skills, mine will be 2 points. One is government of Rwanda created partnerships that enabled us to have a Positivo assembling computers here in Rwanda. The kind of technical skills we need is to go beyond assembling and go to where we actually manufacture these computers here in Rwanda fully. The same goes for Marathon, the phone that is now assembled here in Rwanda, I think the first on the continent. We need to continue to build those kind of technical capabilities so that we can go beyond. The second point is, and maybe this is something you can consider for your next degree at Kepler, is data science. We need to be able to have talent that analyze this kind of data that all these platforms and systems are collecting, to be able to make the right decision, to be able to make the right projections. This not only inform policies, but even the next products that are being designed through the innovation that has been discussed through this conversation. So I think data is going to be the biggest opportunity that we have to continue to create relevant solutions, but also even to understand how can we predict the next trends in the future. So I would definitely make an argument that we must invest in training more people in that area. Thank you.
Eniola, final remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Just three short final remarks. One is that COVID has taught us a lot, especially on the continent, thinking around digital economy not as a luxury, but now as a strategy for resilient countries that are going to benefit from that in by 2030 are going to be ones who realize and action this through leadership, partnership, and through actual grounding countries across Africa that are showing us how it can be done. And there's opportunities to learn there. I think two to that point is around this useful assets. I think we've talked a little bit about what are the assets we really need to develop. One is women and minority voices within this, those voices that hadn't been involved maybe in the first phase of digital economy more globally, and the opportunity that provides. What we've realized, especially from COVID, is no one has plans, but those who are able to kind of dig there and utilize this time of the quote unquote winners. And also the useful assets that exist in private sector, or augmenting technology, existing examples, because historically we kind of seen like a degradation of the solution not being able to be transferable, and therefore not being able to be transferable to societal order. We need to bring that back around and figure out that equation better. And also the third part is around defining what the African 2030 vision is. It is different from maybe global. It has some similarities, but I think there's an opportunity with some of the cooperative methods or the frameworks that we have to play. For example, the African Free Trade Agreement, and utilizing this idea around harmonizing around digital identity. What is the blueprint there? What is the blueprint for connectivity? What is the blueprint for the fundamentals that we have in place that everything else builds from? So that's where I'm
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you, our viewers, and thank you to the Ministry of ICT and Innovation here in Rwanda for setting this up and making this happen. This was a conversation on how technology and innovation can be leveraged to accelerate economic, social, as well as environmental development here on the continent and achieve the sustainable development goals. I was your moderator for today. My names are Narengwa Fiona Muthoni, and I'm a journalist with CNBC Africa, and I'd also like to thank our panelists. Next to me, we have Ivra Dukunda, the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of ICT and Innovation here in Rwanda. Next to him, we have Natalie Munyapenda, the CEO of Kepler University. And finally, Patrick Buchana, the CEO and founder of AC Group. And not forgetting Eniola Mafe, who is a lead 2030 Vision Technology and Sustainable Development at the World Economic Forum. Thank you for tuning in. It's bye for now.